That all right for everybody? Okay, cool. Makes the pictures pop. Well, hello. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really lovely. We've worked in a fantastic family vacation to go along with giving these talks. So we've just had a great time passing through New Mexico. This book came out in July of 2025. So this month is actually kind of the last leg of my bits and pieces here and there book tour. And I'll be kind of transitioning at the end of this month to starting to pre-promote for the next book I have coming out from Timber Press, which is called Atascosa Borderlands. And that will be coming out in November of 2027. If you have any questions about that, I'll be signing books at the end of the talk, and you're welcome to ask me about it. So when Timber Press approached the Arizona Native Plant Society and myself about creating this book, it was really exciting, but it really made me want to think a bit more about why I love native plants. I know I love them, but I don't actually spend that much time thinking about why. I just do, right? So I was reading up on it, and I came across a book by a biogeographer and ecologist named Forrest Shreve, who used to run the Tumamoc Hill Laboratory in Tucson, Arizona. And he has a quote, this was in the early 1900s, that I really love. He said, "Why should the Southwest be ashamed of the things that are its own? Why should we not celebrate that with which nature has so richly endowed us?" And that's really kind of my North Star for this book here. I am a tried and true, dyed-in-the-wool plant lover. I have never met a plant that I don't like. I sometimes, I'm a native plant guy, so I kind of have to do this sneakily. I'll look at pictures of buffel grass in, South Africa, or oleanders growing in canyons in Yemen, and I love them in habitat. So this isn't a rejection of plants from other part of the world. It's not about being dogmatic. I love growing fruits and vegetables in my gardens, but it's really about celebrating the ecological heritage that we are all lucky enough to be the heirs to, and for which we are ultimately responsible. And so why I love native plant gardening is it's a way to take this incredible ecological network that surrounds us and bring it right to our doorstep. Now, the first question that had to be answered in order to write this book is, what the hell is the Southwest? And that took a little bit of figuring out. So for the purposes of this book, it is primarily Arizona and New Mexico, but it also includes portions of California, Texas, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado, right? This is a massive land area and an area of incredible botanical diversity. Arizona and New Mexico are respectively the third and fourth most plant diverse states in the country, right? So, a lot of people, when they think about gardening in an arid region, they think, well, what is there even to grow, right? But what we know as native plant lovers is that we have an absolute embarrassment of riches in the Southwest. There's so many options for plants to grow. So when we started thinking about what plants would make the cut for this book, we really wanted to be as broadly applicable as possible, and a great jumping off point for folks to then maybe dive into books that are really specific to their local area. So we chose plants that cover either a very broad geographic range and therefore are going to be, applicable to a wider number of gardens. And then we also chose some plants that might have a more limited range, but which are so iconic that if you're gardening in the regions they grow, you can't do without them. A great example is saguaro. You're obviously not going to grow that here, but no garden should be without one in the Sonoran Desert. Now, another thing that I think is really critical when we're thinking about what is a native plant is that the plants have never heard of, nor do they care about these lines on the map here, right? So these lines are ultimately fairly arbitrary as far as the plant communities grow. I am, a major part of, I'm very involved with the Arizona Native Plant Society. And so I'm definitely one of those people that will think about what's native through the lens of the state that I live in. But the biotic communities that these plants grow in certainly cross state boundaries. And it's also worth noting that this line here at the bottom was made in the middle of the 19th century by people who had never been to this region and therefore had a very incomplete understanding of the cultural and natural ecology of the southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico. So when we talk about conservation in the southwestern United States, when we talk about what is a native plant, we can't ignore all the stuff in black down here, which is actually where, many of the plants, especially in the southern portions of Arizona and New Mexico, evolved, adapted, and eventually radiated out from. So meaningful conservation of plants in our region involves really interstate and international collaboration. Now, another thing that makes the Southwest so incredibly biodiverse is our topographical diversity, right? So oftentimes when we're thinking about what's a native plant, we might look specifically at, a certain number of miles from our home or our garden. Well, I live in Tucson, Arizona, in the foot of the Santa Catalina Mountains, so I could be 50 miles from my house and at 9,000 feet in elevation. And a Doug fir is simply not going to grow in the Tucson Basin, right? So when we're thinking about what's a native plant for our garden, simply looking at a particular distance from our yard isn't going to really cut it. It's not sufficient. This photo was taken from near the top of Mount Graham. This is in a pine woodland, and it's looking out over a semi-desert grassland and Chihuahuan desert scrub. So there's so many different environments just within this one photo. Incidentally, I was standing on the side of the road with Luke, my photographer, Luke, who took all these pictures, and my son, Julian, when we took this photo, and not 5 minutes later, a black bear walked up onto the road. It was a really exciting experience, memories of a lifetime. So there's a lot of different systems out there for deciding what plants might be appropriate for our gardens, right? The EPA has their climate zones. Obviously, the really well-known ones are going to be the USDA gardening zones. For the purposes of this book, I did not think that the USDA gardening zones were very appropriate, in large part because they were primarily developed, initially really for agricultural purposes, and they've subsequently been sort of extended to cover a lot of horticultural varieties. But ultimately, when you think about a plant, it has evolved over millennia with a number of different, biotic and abiotic factors, things ranging from pollinators to herbivores to rainfall to temperature to soils and aspect. And all of these things go into just making a plant what it is and making it appropriate or not for our landscape. The USDA climate zones strip all of that complexity away and are basically just looking at a single factor, which is more or less how much cold a plant can tolerate, right? And I really feel like the USDA climate zones exist almost exclusively for the purpose of telling you what non-native plants you can get away with growing in your garden, even if you shouldn't, right? It really doesn't take into account any of the incredibly complex factors that determine why a plant grows the way it does. So for this book, we look back at a study conducted in the 1980s by two researchers, Brown and Lowe, that resulted in a book called Biotic Communities of North America. And what I like about this is it uses different plant communities to basically draw the outlines of these larger bioregions. And so when people ask me what I consider native, I really like to take this bioregional approach, right? Because I can understand that, across my region, the Sonoran Desert, there are going to be birds, mammals, pollinators that are moving large distances and are going to be able to utilize plants from within that bioregion. I also like to look at those borders where bioregions meet. We know in biology that the most diverse places in habitats are going to tend to be those places where two different ecosystems are coming together. This is called an ecotone. So where, desert scrub meets grassland, where grassland meets oak, juniper, woodland, that's where a lot of the diversity of our region will tend to live. So I like to look at those zones that, I am gardening in, and then just looking at kind of the zone just above, just below, to really think about what might be appropriate for my landscape. Now, this map is fantastic, but you can also see how complex it is, right? We can see that in many of our mountain ranges, those biotic communities are stacked on top of one another, which is what we can see happening in this photo here. And as anyone who goes hiking, which I assume most of you do, knows, you can be in a single canyon and the plants on the east-facing slope and the plants on the west-facing slope are completely different. So when you get on the ground, there's much more diversity than this map is easily able to capture. And so when we're thinking about what might be appropriate for our garden, well, let's say you have a west-facing yard space. What's growing on that west-facing slope? We're really using Mother Nature as our guide for what's likely to thrive in our landscapes. So again, thinking about native, we have this incredible mosaic of different habitats that cut through the Southwest. For me in Tucson, it's objectively the case that a cottonwood or a sycamore is a native plant. They certainly grow close to where I am gardening, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily appropriate plants for my garden where I'm trying to reduce water use, and I certainly don't have a running waterway anywhere close to my front or backyard. So, just because something grows in the region, just because it is technically native, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the right choice for our garden. But we do have these incredible puzzle pieces of different habitats that we can sort of mix and match to create a biodiverse garden. Now, there's 5 key principles that I really used to guide writing this book. And the first principle, this one is, I think, one of the most important, is that gardens populated with native plants can be beautiful. That's obvious to anyone that's a member of the Native Plant Society, of course, but it seems like the greatest hurdle that we have to overcome in order to get native plants into more yards, right? So many people are coming from different parts of the country, or they're intimidated by the sort of, aggressive looking or scraggly plants that they see out in natural spaces here. And so they do what a lot of people do. They go to the Home Depot, they go to the Lowe's, they go to that garden center, and they just grab whatever's flowering, right? Because they think that's what's needed to create a beautiful landscape. But we live, again, in Arizona and New Mexico, the 3rd and 4th most plant diverse states in the country. In Arizona, there's 4,000 species of plants. Do we really think that we can't create a beautiful garden with some of those, right? That's a very limiting mindset. So first and foremost, we have to understand that we can create gorgeous spaces using native plants. And this isn't simply like an aesthetic preference or me on my soapbox, though I do like getting on my soapbox and shouting at people. What this is really about is that there are ecological consequences to not understanding this core concept, right? And we can see those from, the Russian olive and from the tamarisks that are infesting waterways throughout the Southwest and displacing native riparian species. In Tucson, we can see this from, the fountain grass, right? Because some landscape architect looked at the 400 plus species of grasses in Arizona and said, no, none of these will do. I need to just bring something over for Southern Africa, with no understanding of what the repercussions might be. Well, the repercussions have been that that plant has sort of hopped out of horticultural areas and is now very widespread in natural habitats throughout the Sonoran Desert region, and it is rapidly changing the fire ecology of the Sonoran Desert. So it is having major ecological consequences. So, choosing native plants is not something we should do just because we like them, but because there are actual repercussions to doing the opposite. Now, another point that I think is really critical and is the second principle for the book is that using native plants, we can create landscapes that are lush and inviting without unsustainable water inputs, right? So I get this all the time as somebody professionally sells plants. So if they're native plants, right, they don't need any water, do they? Well, any of us that have tried to establish a native plant in our garden knows that that's not the case. Not in the least, because in habitat, plants don't grow in black plastic pots with circling root masses, right? These things coming out of a nursery have been ultimately quite babied, and they need to adjust to the conditions that we're putting them in our yards. However, if we are just going out and every day throwing as much water as we can on these plants, not only are we likely to kill many of these native plant species that, thrive in an arid ecosystem, but at that point, it's like we might as well just be growing a bunch of unhappy chlorotic roses because we're using the same amount of water and we know that it's our most precious resource. So ultimately, native plant gardening should go hand in hand with sustainable gardening practices. I want to point out something I think that's kind of hidden in this photo, but I found really interesting. When I showed up to photograph and interview these people about their garden, they were up on a ladder. You can sort of see the ladder in the photo there, tying mistletoe into their mesquite trees because they were trying to attract the great purple hair-streaked butterfly, which uses that as its larval food source, and the phainopepla, which is this beautiful desert bird. It's got the great black mohawk. It's very punk rock. And it really relies on mistletoe in leguminous trees like mesquites. So these folks were not thinking about their plants as individual specimens. Rather, they were thinking about their yard as a miniature ecosystem and looking at the ways that they could increase the biodiversity using this native plant palette. Now, depending on where you are in the Southwest, there's really a lot of different regulations about, how much water you can harvest. In the state of Colorado, it's actually illegal to harvest and hold more than 110 gallons of rainwater at a given time, which is like barbaric as far as I'm concerned, right? You compare that to a place like Tucson, Arizona, where the city will give you up to $2,000 back as a water harvesting rebate for installing things like cisterns, basins, and swales in your yard. So, you do want to be familiar with the policies and regulations in your local municipality, but ultimately we should be very focused on bringing that water that falls out of the sky. And I was hoping for a miracle here. As I was going through this slide in Santa Fe last night, it started raining and we all kind of whooped and hollered, but no such luck tonight. So we've all seen it during a big rain event. Tens of thousands of gallons of water just rushing down impermeable surfaces, never to be seen again by us, right? So there's things that we can do in public rights of way if our municipalities will allow it. If they won't allow it, then, Tucson's a fabulous example of how a small but dedicated group of people can, by constantly needling at the slow turning wheels of bureaucracy, get really meaningful changes put into city codes and regulations. So this is a street side chicane near downtown Tucson that pulls water off of the roadways and directs it into a basin there. And this is in a public right-of-way, so everyone who's utilizing that sidewalk benefits from that feature. We can also do things in our homes. This is in Silver City, New Mexico, where you should certainly go for the state conference. This is a great water harvesting cistern. You can see the rain clouds in the back there. So this allows this gardener to store that water away for what would normally be called for a rainy day, but in this case is called a droughty day. And that water can then be used on the landscape. So it's a fabulous way to protect that resource. This is another great example. This is a backyard outdoor shower. Now this isn't in some, rural environment. If this person is out there, whistling and singing while they're lathering themselves, all their neighbors are going to be hearing it, right? But it still is a really beautiful private space. And what I love about it is that the water is getting used 3 times. So the person's had a nice hard day gardening, they're covered in dirt and sweat. The water that comes out of that spigot there is obviously going to wash that off. Then it is going to hit this creosote bush that's in the corner there, and that's going to emit that lovely creosote smell that you get after a rainstorm. After watering that plant, the water is going to move through a French drain that carries it into a basin that's outside the frame of this photo. So every drop of water is getting used 3 times. It's a fantastic way to make the most of that resource. Now, tied in with water conservation is the conservation of this other amazing resource that falls out of the sky, leaves. And, when they're on the tree, when they're turning beautifully golden or red or orange in the fall, we think about how beautiful they are. And then the moment they hit the ground, suddenly they're litter, right? It's a very demeaning thing to call these beautiful, beautiful leaves that our plants need in order to grow, right? I have, seen landscapers with not 1, but 2 leaf blowers at the same time, blowing all the leaves out of somebody's yard into the street where they can be washed away in the next rainstorm. And all of those nutrients are going to disappear out of the landscape. That person, that landscaper is then going to go out and they're going to buy some, wood chips treated with a chemical dye in order to mulch this person's yard that they just blew all the natural mulch out of, right? So I think we really need to appreciate this amazing resource and think about what it can do for us. Now, certainly in a fire-prone area, we might want to be conscientious about having, a duff layer all over our landscape, but we can concentrate all of these fallen leaves into basins, swales, planting beds, in order to make the most of those nutrients that in a natural ecosystem would cycle through the soil, right? And all we're doing is learning from Mother Nature and mimicking that practice in our landscape in order to save time and save money. Now, the third key principle guiding this book is that gardens populated with native plants will encourage lots of visits from wildlife, and these visits are to be encouraged. So you get to the point in a lot of gardening books where the author starts talking about pest management, about all of the miracles of modern science that will allow you to keep all of these nasty critters out of your garden, right? Well, if you're gardening with native plants, that's a real uphill battle. And the point should be to get as many of these guys as possible in your garden eating your plants. And again, it takes a real mindset shift. So early in my horticultural career, I was working at a plant nursery, and a young couple came in. They were buying their first home, and they wanted to create a monarch butterfly way station. So great, we're walking around. We're picking out milkweeds. We're having a great time. We're really excited. I get up to the cash register and I'm just kind of leaning over talking to them. And I'm like, boy, isn't it going to be so exciting when you see the first caterpillar eating the leaves of this plant? And their jaws hit the floor and they were staring daggers at me like I had just kicked their puppy. They were like, but we don't want caterpillars. We want butterflies. Okay, all right. So we had to really go back to the beginning. We had to have what is almost literally a birds and the bees conversation about where butterflies come from. If you want butterflies and moths in your garden, then these guys right here need something to eat, right? Ultimately, if we have a landscape that is not diverse, if we have 1, 2, or just 3 plant species that kind of dominate our garden, then it is very possible that a single pest could come in and clear out a lot of that vegetation, right? But in a biodiverse system, these things are self-regulating. They are cyclical, they have peaks, they have valleys. Because if you have a layered landscape with a lot of biodiversity of plants, with a lot of cover for different forms of wildlife, then as soon as these guys show up, you know what else is going to show up? Is the creatures that eat those guys right there, right? So the more diversity we have, the more resilient our landscape is going to tend to be, and the more these issues are likely to work themselves out. Now, there may be years where we have a lot of a particular insect eating our plants, and it certainly can be detrimental. But in a diverse ecosystem, even those damaged plants tend to become a little bit less noticeable, and we can at least pat ourselves on the back with the knowledge that at a time where we know that there is a massive decline in pollinators and birds throughout North America, we may have lost a plant, but we were supporting these guys, and really that should be part of why we're gardening with native plants in the first place. Now, another key principle guiding the book is that gardening with native plants connects us to wider regional efforts at conservation. And the example I like to use is this guy right here, the Sonoran desert tortoise. So though he looks like he is just slaughtered and devouring a defenseless animal, he is happily eating a prickly pear fruit, right? So in the state of Arizona, there are about 400 of these desert tortoises currently being held in captivity by the State Game and Fish Department, and they cannot be released into the wild. And we know that the greatest single threat to this species in its habitat is fragmentation of that habitat, the development of subdivisions, highways, data centers, warehouses. All of these things are taking habitat away from animals like the Sonoran desert tortoise. So as a native plant gardener, you can show the Game and Fish Department a picture of your yard, show them that you have food sources for this animal, and you can then adopt one of these tortoises. And you are now using your small garden as a center for conservation of wildlife. Now, this is just one example. This can happen with birds, butterflies, lizards, snakes, whatever the case may be. By gardening with native plants, we are helping to ameliorate the single most imminent threat to much of the wildlife in our region, which is habitat fragmentation. And this can take place at many scales, from a single terracotta pot on our back patio that brings in a particular butterfly caterpillar, all the way up to very large spaces, multi-acre spaces that we are shepherding back to health. Now, the fifth principle guiding this book is that the more people who engage in gardening with native plants and responsible landscaping practices, the greater the impacts will be for the human and other than human organisms that we share this incredible landscape with. So I think about this based on a song that my family listens to every noon time at Thanksgiving, called Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie. Some of you may be familiar. It's a great family tradition. And, you know, somewhere in that 25-minute long song or whatever it is, there's a line I love, which is that, you know, to paraphrase, if one person does it, they'll think he's sick. If 3 people do it, they'll think it's a movement. If 50 people do it, they'll think it's an organization. And I apply this to native plant landscaping. If one person in a neighborhood is gardening with native plants, they have created an island, valuable but isolated. If 3 people do it, you now have an archipelago of spaces that certain animals are going to be able to move between. If 50 people in a neighborhood are gardening with native plants, you have now created a large interconnected landscape that has the ability to support not only more species, but more individuals of each species. So it really starts to become a very valuable habitat, even if it's located, you know, in an urban area. Now, in terms of, you know, how to garden with native plants in our area, well, you know, there's a lot of ways to go about this. But the first thing to think about is, you know, how are we going to make the most of the limited space that most of us are working with? So a great place to start is building down and building up. So first and foremost, we can create basins that are going to draw water off of pathways, off of roads, and direct it to where our plants are growing. This is nice because it gives us an opportunity to grow plants that might otherwise be a little bit more water hungry, that might naturally occur in a slightly wetter habitat. And we're making sure to direct all of that water that would otherwise just run away from our landscape to these plants. Now, when you do that, you end up with all the dirt that you dug out of that hole. And you can use that to create mounds. They're going to tend to be better draining. You can put in rocks to reflect heat. And now you are taking a 2-dimensional plane, you know, an urban yard, and you are turning it into a 3-dimensional planting area by building up and down. So you are creating ultimately more plantable area, but also more diversified microclimates where different types of plants can thrive, right? So we can direct, you know, gray water from washing machines, showers, sinks into those basins, and we can use minimal irrigation on these high and dry spaces, allowing us to make the most of a fairly small gardening area to really increase our plantable area and potential diversity. And while I tend to be a little rough on landscape architects because of the many horticultural atrocities that they have committed across the region, we shouldn't throw the landscape architecture baby out with the bathwater. There are certain principles that we can, you know, would be recognizable in any sort of garden in the country and bring them into our landscapes. You know, wide, accessible pathways that are usable by the largest number of people. Fantastic. Well-defined planting areas. Planting in layers with, you know, raised and lower areas that might have plants of different heights, textures, and bloom seasons. These are all fabulous ways to create a really lush and inviting landscape that, you know, you're going to want to be in. And this is particularly important for people that live in areas that have, you know, a very active, intransigent, litigious, argumentative HOA landscape committee member that just can't wait to write you up for the littlest infraction. And then you can do whatever you want in the back. You can have tire fires, rusted out trucks, throw all your trash out there. This is the mullet approach to gardening. It is business in the front and it is party in the back. So, you know, that curb appeal makes a difference in that the best advertisement for gardening with native plants is beautiful native plant gardens. And what I love about this, it's kind of a little sort of secret hidden in the photo, is that if you look in the back there, you can see part of a ridge line. So this is in a, you know, very cookie cutter suburban neighborhood in Flagstaff, Arizona. but it's close to a city park and green space. So, the critters that are living in that green space are going to be able to make their way to this garden and find additional resources that might not be available to them anywhere else in that entire neighborhood. Now, as a corollary to all of this, it is possible to create the worst garden in the world with native plants. So this particular triptych of horticulture disasters is pretty specific to Tucson, but let's not pretend that you guys don't have similar atrocities taking place, right here in Taos. It's just going to be different plants, but the same things going wrong. So I want to start with plant selection, right? So in this case, it's a nativar called the Desert Museum Palo Verde, and it was selected for a lot of qualities that people are going to tend to like. Well, it's spineless because gosh, there's surely not a reason that all these desert plants evolved spines, right? It has a long bloom season. Well, it also has a lot less nectar and pollen available for the pollinators, so those blooms don't really do all that much good for wildlife. And it grows really fast, but it kind of grows like one of those chickens in those horrible sort of chicken farms where they grow really fast and they can't stand on their own legs and therefore fall over. Same thing happens to this tree. It grows really fast. And then what's going to happen is we're going to get a monsoon microburst through there. And because it's been lion-tailed to put all the weight at the top of the tree, the whole thing's going to fall over. It's going to crush somebody's Tesla. They're going to say, hey, I hate native plants. I'm never gardening with these lousy things. I'm going to run out and get a Aleppo pine or something like that. All that we're doing by kind of selecting the wrong plant and by abusing that plant once it's in the ground is we're setting it up for failure. And that's especially true in an already difficult planting area here. This is, the height of American horticulture. This is a Walmart parking lot. So it's got everything, abandoned shopping carts, masks blowing across the parking area, but tons of reflected heat. I'm sure this is completely nutrient bereft fill soil. It's probably compacted down into its basically pavement, and they probably planted this thing still in the 25-gallon pot that it came in, right? So everything's already wrong here. Now we move on to putting the wrong plant in the wrong space. So this is Satol Desert Spoon. Fabulous plant, has, it's broadly applicable across a huge portion of the Southwest, very resilient, both in low elevation gardens in Phoenix and really high elevation gardens in, Santa Fe. So fabulous plant. But anyone who's grown it knows that it can get about 5 feet wide and the whole thing's covered in razor sharp spines on every leaf, right? So these, landscapers in all their wisdom decided to plant it like 1.5 feet off of a major pedestrian path and bike route, right? And so that necessitates them, hacking this thing into the shape of a very sad, depressed pineapple. And what's going to end up happening is that trunk is going to get scorched. The plant's going to have a shorter lifespan. Great for the landscaper because they're going to get hired to come out and plant the whole thing all over again, rinse and repeat, right? So proper placement is important. Going out into natural spaces is a great way to learn about, what plants we should cultivate and kind of how they grow. But it's also well worth visiting, botanical gardens, arboretum, public gardens around our area to see how the plants are going to behave in cultivation because they might get bigger, their form might change a little bit. So think about where we're planting plants. And a great example of that can be seen in this last photo here, which honestly, props to these people. I think 99% of the population would have gotten rid of the saguaro. These people decided to accommodate it by creating a hole in their roof. But we can see what's happening here. The trunk of that saguaro is becoming girdled. They expand and contract with rainfall. So what's going to happen is that eventually the top of that saguaro is going to fall over. This is a major roadway right in front of this house. It's like a massive 4-way intersection. Top of that thing is going to go rolling out onto Broadway Boulevard. It's going to cause a 5-car pileup. Now, all 5 of those Tesla drivers are going to be like, I hate native plants. I'm never using those. I'm going to go out and get a bunch of oleanders, right? So, we want to make sure that we have an understanding of how our plants are going to behave when we put them in the landscape, and we want to set them up for success by choosing the right plant for the right area and engaging in proper maintenance. And watch out for people that call themselves arborists. Make sure that you check on other projects they've worked on before you invite them into your beautiful garden. Another point that I think is really important is that we should all be supporting our local nurseries, right? It is unfortunately still the case, and will be, I think, for quite some time, that there is very limited availability of native plants. There's not a lot of diversity of native plants in the horticultural scene, and there's very small quantities being cultivated. Even like local garden centers still really haven't caught on to the native plant trend. An example I ran into was I was talking to some folks who are landscape architects, but some of the good ones. And they were working on a massive development project, and around the margins of the project, where it kind of interfaced with the natural space, they wanted to put 300 gray thorns. Great native plant, not, a traditionally beautiful specimen, but fantastic for wildlife, a lot of great habitat and food for birds. The project gets done, and they're talking to the landscape contractor who carried out the project. Well, how'd it go? How'd it go with the gray thorns? Couldn't get them, so I planted 300 rosemaries instead. Well, I got no problem with rosemaries, love them, have one in my backyard, but they're gonna have a very different sort of ecological value than those native plants. So first and foremost, we really need to be focused on increasing availability. One of the ways to do this is when we're going to our local nursery, we ask for the native plant that we're looking for, and they are like, we don't have it, but we'll substitute you for insert X, Y, and Z plant from Eurasia. We just say no, and we don't buy the plant. And we leave our number and ask them to call us when they have the native plant we're looking for. Ultimately, a lot of these local nurseries and garden centers are small businesses with low profit margins who really do want to make sure that they're selling plants. So they're going to be driven by supply and demand. We might walk into our local Home Depot or Lowe's and ask for these plants, and they're going to laugh us out the front sliding door because they ultimately are going to be less attuned to the needs of local growers. Not to mention that the plants that they have may be grown in some completely other part of the world that, grown under very different climatic circumstances. So when that plant coming from, California says full sun, and we put it out in a garden here in the Southwest, we know that full sun means something very different there than it does here. So really supporting those local growers who are already doing the right thing is a fabulous start, and making sure that when we're going to garden centers that haven't quite caught on, that we are asking for these native plants. We are the squeaky wheels that'll ultimately get the grease. Another thing that's been really encouraging to see is that in the absence of a lot of major wholesale growers that are producing this type of material, a lot of people are just starting very small, like backyard scale growing operations. So as native plant enthusiasts, Tim can specialize on growing grasses. Susie can be growing cacti and succulents. Johnny over here is growing flowering shrubs and trees. We could be communicating with one another. We could be showing up to Native Plant Society events, everyone bringing their little selection of plants from their backyards. And at that very small, specialized scale, we can at least make a small dent in the availability of some of these native plants. So I think we're going to see a real shift from reliance on these massive wholesalers who are not connected to local needs towards hopefully a more locally based form of horticulture where people are, really growing germplasm that's specifically adapted to the area that they are growing. Because a native plant is not necessarily a native plant. In other words, there are certain species with broad topographic and geographic ranges where, if you're growing that plant, but the seed's coming from a much lower elevation garden, it may not do well in your space, even though that species occurs in your area. So local germplasm is as important as choosing the right plant for our garden. Now, when I was early in my horticulture career, I came across the works of a Japanese author, Masanobu Fukuoka, that was deeply inspiring to me. The main concept that has always stuck with me is his concept of do-nothing gardening, which doesn't actually mean do nothing. If I couldn't work in my yard, I'd go insane. I love fiddling around in my yard. But ultimately, when I'm approaching a landscape, I like to think about what are all of the things that I don't have to do, right? And that's one of the things I love about native plant gardening is that we can significantly reduce the amount of offside inputs that are needed in order for those plants to thrive in our garden. Obviously, we all know that plants take care and tending to establish, whether they're native or not. But my goal is always to reduce gardening down to its simplest facet, digging a hole, and putting a plant in it. And gardening with native plants allows me to get at least one step closer to that so that I can just be out in my garden enjoying it instead of finding it to be a constant labor and source of frustration, right? So there are so many good reasons to garden with native plants, and just reducing the workload is one of them. Now, when it comes to the book itself, it's divided into an introductory section that deals with those 5 principles and goes into detail about, gardening practices that are kind of common across, gardens throughout this arid region. And then in terms of plant profiles, we focus on trees. This is really where you want to start with your garden. Most of us are going to have, a limited capacity to plant trees because of their large size. We want to focus on things that are appropriate for our landscape so that we're not going to hack on them to make them work, or so that they're not going to end up running their roots, through our walls and wrapping themselves around toilet pipes, things like that. So we want to choose the right tree for the location, because hopefully that tree is going to be with us for the life of that garden. And it's really going to be the centerpiece around which the garden is built, especially in arid environments where there's not necessarily a lot of organic matter or available nutrients in the soil. These trees can really serve as islands of fertility that are providing shade. They're pulling up water from deeper stratas of the soil. They're depositing nutrients in the forms of leaves, flowers, and fruits. All of this stuff can really increase the richness and quality of the soil around them and support the growth of a lot of other species. And the flip side of that is they can also create a lot of shade that might preclude certain species being planted around them. So we want to start with trees and be very thoughtful about our selection. From there, we're going to move into shrubs. Shrubs are a really, really fun part of gardening because they're going to establish much of the character of our garden, the types of textures that we see, the bloom seasons that we have, and the wildlife that might be attracted to these spaces. So shrub selection is also quite important, and it's going to have a major impact on sort of what types of wildlife you're getting in your space, hopefully enjoying the nectar and hopefully not eating too much of those newly planted plants. From there, we're going to move into perennials. Now, there's a lot of ways to approach this. The nice thing about, annual and perennial, fast-growing, short-lived plants is that they provide instant gratification. So while our shrubs, while our trees may take years to reach, full size, these guys can do it in a few months in some cases. But they may also kind of have that live fast, die young policy. So we might mix planting certain plants in pots with throwing out a lot of locally adapted native plant seed. That'll kind of create some stages of succession in our gardens. And even though these are small plants, they're quite mighty in terms of being able to attract pollinators and in terms of having this fast life cycle that turns over nutrients in our gardens. Just like the leaves that fall from our trees, as our annuals and as our perennials die, we want to be considerate of the fact that, the seeds in those dry seed heads are a valuable food resource, and that we can chop that material and let it lay right there on the ground, and we're going to be adding organic matter and mulch to the soil over time. And there's so many complex and beautiful relationships that we can get out of these small plants. One of my favorite examples is the mist flower here and queen butterflies. So interestingly, 90+% of all the queen butterflies that are attracted to this plant are actually males. And we might just think, oh, they're gathering nectar or whatever, they're doing their butterfly thing. But in addition to that, they're actually harvesting a chemical called intermedine, which is a sexual attractant pheromone for queen butterflies. So these guys are lapping it up, and then when they take off, all the ladies are like, hey, check that guy out. He's chock full of intermedine. And they are going to preferentially mate with those males. And then the males will pass on to the females in the form of, and bless entomologists for coming up with this term, a nuptial gift. And that nuptial gift is that intermedine that they've been harvesting, which is then passed on to the eggs laid by that female butterfly, making them unpalatable to potential predators, right? So there is so much complexity in nature, things that are happening that we have no awareness or understanding of. And by bringing a few of these plants into our yard, we can support some of those poorly understood relationships. And, selecting the right plant for our garden could be the difference between having or not having a particular species of wildlife in our landscape. Then we move on to the oft neglected, sadly overlooked members of our natural ecosystems. My personal favorite, the grasses. So they do so much in terms of adding texture and effect and organic matter to our landscapes, but they can also play a surprisingly important ecological role despite not being what we would consider pollinator plants. So for instance, almost all grasses are going to have one, if not more, species of skipper butterflies that use them as a larval food source. We also know that they can provide important nesting habitat for different bird species. A great example in the Southwest is giant saccatone right there, Sporobolus reittii. This plant only occurs in about 5% of its historic range, which means that the botarized sparrow, a bird which is an obligate nester in this grass, now only occurs in 5% of its historic range. So grasses can play a really important ecological role, and sometimes a more complex and interesting role than we might think. Another example here is tanglehead. So this grass is part of a tribe in the grass family called Andropogoneae. There won't be a quiz after, you don't need to remember that. But an interesting thing about that family is that it's often parasitized by fungi. We know that grasses can be parasitized by fungi. The most famous example is the ergot fungus, which is the natural source for LSD, and has been implicated in all sorts of cases of mass hysteria throughout history, such as the Salem witch trials or the dancing plague in Germany, where people were apparently dancing themselves literally to death. And that's because rye, which is a grass that would be parasitized by the fungi, was mixed in with the wheat that people were eating. But in the case of tanglehead here, a fungus will colonize the grass. That fungus will attract ants. The ants will produce sugary honeydew, which then attracts butterflies, beetles, wasps, and all types of other insects. And so that single grass species is creating this complex ecological web around itself. We don't tend to think of the Southwest as a big area for vines, and it's not. Vines tend to evolve in habitats where shade is a major limiting factor. In most gardens in the Southwest, we're not worried about too much shade. That's really actually the problem we'd like to have. But the Southwest has really led to the development of a number of interesting arid-adapted vine species. One of my favorite in the region is this guy right here, the pipe vine. So it's really an interesting genus. What the flowers of this plant have evolved to do is to attract tiny little flies that would normally drink blood out of the ears of mice and rats. So it resembles, I guess, a mouse ear, and presumably it exudes some sort of fragrance that attracts these small flies. What happens is they go into the throat of that flower, and then all those little hairs there act like a spike strip in a parking garage, and they'll trap the fly in there. It's buzzing around, picking up nectar, picking up pollen, and then the flower releases them. Flies, not being known for their brilliance and intelligence, just immediately go into the next flower, and that's how the plants get pollinated. So it's like a almost not quite carnivorous flower. It's really an interesting adaptation. So vines and ground covers are fabulous because they can help kind of spread and cool the soil. They can add another layer in our landscape that's going to create additional habitat, growing up trees and larger shrubs. And of course, one of the things that makes gardening in our region is the amazing selection of cacti and succulents that we can utilize in our gardens. And we really shouldn't be afraid of or intimidated by these plants. They are certainly spiny. I certainly have my share of cactus spines that are like just slowly decomposing inside of my skin. But gardening with them is one of the true pleasures of horticulture in this region. So we shouldn't shy away from them. Not only are they beautiful and iconic to this region, but they're also powerhouse wildlife plants. Things like prickly pears. The flowers are often pollinated by specialized cactus bees. The fruits are a major food resource for a variety of wildlife. And I'll point out, earlier I showed those poor hacked-on pineapple-looking desert spoons. This is a desert spoon that's been allowed to grow to its full size. So just emphasizing plant selection matters. And it's also important to note that, gardening with native plants is not some brand spanking new concept. People have been doing it in this region for millennia. A great example can be seen here with these Huachuca agaves, which are being grown on a hillside in southeastern Arizona. at the top of the hill are numerous agave roasting pits. This plant is being grown well below its typical elevational range. So it's very clear that in this case, Chiricahua Apache people were spreading this plant around to provide a sort of evergreen, fail-safe food source during times of drought or extreme heat. And those plants have continued to thrive in that very intelligent location where they were placed. So, this isn't some new concept. And what I think is so fabulous here is that gardening with native plants is not it's not science fiction. It's not some brand new idea. It's simply a return to the practices that have sustained people in this region for millennia, which have been an integral part of the past of humanity in the Southwest, and which I think will be an integral part of the future of humanity in this region. And it's also important to remember that we are not just doing this for ourselves or for the current generations of wildlife that we share our land with. We are doing this so that future generations may thrive, so that we are responsibly using the resources that we ultimately have to steward, so that we are, preserving wild natural spaces from invasions by, horticultural varieties that are being chosen for all the wrong reasons, and so that we are creating gardens and landscapes and urban areas that are beautiful and enjoyable to be in. So ultimately, I think native plant gardening is one of the greatest joys in the world. I think it is something that connects us to the places that we live and allows each and every one of us to meaningfully engage in conservation of the incredible ecology of this beautiful, beautiful region. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I am going to be signing and selling books over here. If you have questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them. And I'll turn on the lights. Any questions out there in the audience? No? No? Yes. Yeah. So the thing about grasshoppers, think about the biblical swarms of locusts, right? These are things that happen periodically. It generally won't be like the same number or even sort of demographic species composition year after year. So they might target one thing and then another thing. Some years they'll be devastating, and then it might be several years where you don't see them. The first thing to realize is that in this environment, many of the plants have evolved with that as one of their selective pressures, right? So certain plants certainly may get killed, but generally speaking, not all of the plants are going to get killed, right? And many of the plants can be eaten back quite a bit and then actually recover. So there is coevolution happening with these grasshoppers. And again, our best sort of insulation is a diversity, both in the number of species, but also the growth forms represented in our gardens, low-growing ground covers, grasses, perennial shrubs, trees, because generally those grasshoppers are going to maybe mow down a certain species or a certain selection of species, but they're not going to necessarily touch everything in the garden. As far as non-native species, certainly some may be introduced, and they could be particularly devastating because they're freed from the sort of natural regulating factors they've evolved with. But generally speaking, grasshoppers are not going to devastate every single plant in a diverse native plant garden. And there will be certain species that are attracted to certain plants and not others. And that's where diversity becomes a great fail-safe for us. Yep, you had a question.
Well, I had an invasion of aphids.
Yep.
And they were on my milkweed plant, and then they were on the honeysuckle vine. And I read that they could kill a plant. So I used soapy water on them.
Let me ask you this. And you mentioned that you used an intervention, soapy water, which is a tried and true method. Did they kill any of your plants?
No, but I thought they might be thinking about it.
So yeah, absolutely. It's obviously concerning. It's deeply embedded in our horticultural zeitgeist that we get worried when we see stuff eating our plants. And it is not outside the realm of possibility that aphids in significant enough quantities could be relatively devastating to at least one or two species. I have never seen milkweed aphids kill a milkweed. I do think it's possible. I think particularly a seedling in a greenhouse, something like that, it's certainly possible. But I have never actually seen milkweed aphids kill a milkweed in the ground. Again, not to say it couldn't happen, but I've never seen it. And I've seen a lot of aphids and a lot of milkweeds. I think generally these things are regulating. We know that plants are, if not conscious in the way that we are, certainly have some very intelligent adaptations. We know that as plants are being eaten, they can, chemically signal the production of greater quantities of defensive secondary compounds. In the case of milkweeds, it's cardiac glycoside. That's that stuff in the latex that can literally kill you. It's a heart toxin. And we know that not only do they signal to themselves or even to members of the same species planted nearby, but they can even communicate sometimes, and in some cases probably more than we have currently documented, across genera and families. So generally speaking, the aphids might get one over on the first plant they hit, but that second plant is going to be building up its defensive mechanisms. So generally speaking, we feel a need to intervene when often we don't actually need to. And again, it's not to say that there aren't times where it's justified, but oftentimes, if we let nature sort of take its course, we'd find that these things are more resilient than we give them credit for. Again, those aphids have evolved with those milkweeds, right? So they have evolved together over millennia. If those aphids were truly so devastating, there wouldn't be any milkweeds left. Any other questions before we move over to book signing and all that good stuff? No? Oh, yes, right here.
You had a photo of a greenhouse, and behind it, I'm curious what is behind it.
Great question. I love this. It's almost like sci-fi greenhouse I've ever seen. This is at the Flagstaff Arboretum. If you haven't been, it's fabulous. They're amazing. So what they did was they built this greenhouse with all of these basically giant beakers of water in the back that insulate it from extremes of heat and cold. Now, in speaking to their greenhouse manager and asking, does it work? She's kind of like, meh, but it's certainly a good idea. So that's what you see back there are water holding tubes that in theory prevent extremes of heat and cold in the greenhouse. I saw another hand in the back.
Words of encouragement for gardeners in a very, 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 very dry time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is absolutely the case that we are in the worst drought in 1,200 years, right? The last time there was a drought like this in the Southwest, many of those ruins that we see, those beautiful archaeological sites that we see around the region became archaeological sites because the people were forced to abandon them and move to other places and into different sort of life ways. So I don't want to diminish the fact that it is not just dry, it is extremely, one might say, as the smoke drifts down into the valley, apocalyptically dry, right? However, I think we have this conception that these poor plants growing in this dry, drought-stricken region, right? Well, these plants have evolved in these conditions. In fact, if we put them in, the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest, they'd tank on us and die a lot faster than they'll die from drought. So, all that to say, we do have to be conscientious about the plants that we're selecting to make sure we're leaning towards more drought-tolerant species and varieties of plants. This is where local germplasm is really important. And it's also where collecting germplasm from legally, with permits, ethically and responsibly from wild habitats becomes valuable because those plants aren't in a greenhouse generation after generation. They're being exposed to the full brunt of this drought. And so looking at plants that are growing on particularly dry, exposed, hot sites is a great place for us to look for plants that might do well in a very dry period in our garden. Yep. Yes, sir, you in the camo in the front there. What a handsome gentleman. Who's your dad? Why do droughts happen? Well, there's a number of reasons that droughts happen. We live in a dry region, so, droughts are a natural part of life here. In the case of the extreme drought that we're experiencing now, it seems to be largely driven by anthropogenic influences, the immense release of carbon from the environment, deforestation. Even in our region, we have all this caliche that everyone hates, but caliche is a massive carbon sink. When we bust that stuff open to build subdivisions, that carbon goes into the atmosphere. So that is part of why we are dealing with such an extreme drought. What a pertinent and intelligent question, sir. Oh, and in addition to the books, I have posters featuring 4 photos from the book, They are the same price as the book, $25, and you are welcome to pick them up right here. My wife would be extremely happy if I was clearing the box of posters out of our spare bedroom. Thank you all.